a similar sort of question. Some people, we encounter this in the GMO debates as well. Some people will recoil from this thought that we should meddle in the, especially in the genes of other species on the grounds that we don't know what all the bad consequences would be, but also there's a more primordial objection, it seems like, where people think we just shouldn't play God. I mean, it's not that you have to be a theist in order to hold this position, but it's something like there's a hubris or there's something that's not quite appropriate about us meddling in such a dramatic way in the genetic makeup of other species, be they plants or animals. Do you find any ethical force to that kind of response?
Not really, no. That's a concern that I don't share. It's an attitude that I don't really understand. I think some people had similar views about efforts to produce medicines that would cure diseases, analgesics that would help reduce pain. All of these things are unnatural. But if we can, in the human case, eliminate terrible diseases through genetic intervention, I don't see why we shouldn't do so. And if we can greatly reduce the amount of suffering that there is in the world by altering the genes of certain animals, again, I just don't see any reason why we shouldn't do so. I do understand the worry that people have that we may get it wrong, and the consequences of getting it wrong may actually be catastrophic.
Right.
So I do think that it is important to retain a sense of humility and great caution and not proceed precipitately with any of these things. But the idea that there's something objectionable about the enterprise in itself seems to me very odd.
Interesting. What about the pleasure and flourishing of the carnivore or the omnivore? Are you taking that into account in developing your answer to the thought experiment? So we're now taking out of existence or changing and thereby altering their ability to perceive this pleasure the meat eaters of the world, who presumably get quite a bit of pleasure and, of course, nutrition and flourishing out of their predatory practices.
Well, there's a short answer to that, and it's given in the little quotation that I have from Schopenhauer at the very beginning of the New York Times article that I think you're having the students read, and it is that just compare the suffering that the prey animal goes through in being eaten with whatever pleasure the predator gets from the eating.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see that it seems very likely that the suffering and pain and so on outweigh the pleasure.
So it's similar to the human case. We, of course, do experience pleasure in eating factory farmed bacon or something like that, but it's not enough to outweigh all the pain. Right.
Exactly. And the loss of the pleasures that those animals who are eaten could have had they gone on living and been able to continue having enjoyable meals themselves.
Right.
So each time a predator eats a prey animal, the predator gets a meal, but the prey animal loses an indefinitely large number of future meals that it would have had and enjoyed, presumably to the same extent that the predator animal enjoyed it eating its prey.
Right. So you said something about limit cases like insects and mollusks and things like that. What about fish and birds? Are you thinking that if we could do this for predatory fish and birds, we should also do it for the same reasons?
Yes, provided that their prey do suffer.
Yeah. Well, the mice in the field, when the owl goes after them. Yeah.
Yeah. It does seem to me to be a rather bad thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Some people claim that when the mouse is caught in the talons of the owl or the falcon or whatever, it experiences a rush of chemicals in the brain that diminish the suffering it goes through. That may well be true, but if it's not, then there's a lot of suffering that's being caused when mice are snatched out of fields by owls and falcons.
Okay, so another objection that one might raise to this is not so much about what happens if we start altering species, genetic makeup, or taking species out of the ecosystem, and we're not sure about what's going to happen. I mean, you've already addressed that and said we should be very, very cautious. What about people who would think of biodiversity itself as just a kind of intrinsic good? It's just good to have as many species doing as many different things in the world out there, and to try to reduce diversity is itself a kind of negative, ethically negative action.
I'm sympathetic to that view. I think it's difficult to give reasons for thinking that species diversity is in itself good. It would have to be impersonally good. That is, it would be good even though it may not be good for anybody. It's a view that I have a lot of sympathy with, but I don't think that the idea that we might wish to reduce the number of carnivorous species, perhaps to zero, entails that we would have to have diminished species diversity, because if we can eliminate species, we might be able to create new species as well. Or we might think if we, instead of eliminating carnivorous animals, modified them genetically so that they just cease to be carnivorous, then we may retain the species in a different condition. Or if converting a carnivorous species to a herbivorous species involves the extinction of one species, it also then involves the bringing into existence of a new species.